Now welcome to another lightning response video, where this time I've got a comment or question or questions that I tend to get asked all the time, so let's give them an answer. And it comes to us from Siberian Dream, who asked, "Hey Thor, in your videos I noticed you default a lot to the authority of George Lucas, which I understand he's the creator and he deserves a place at the table. However, I take the view that you shouldn't take George Lucas too literally, because he changed his mind a lot. He's well known for being inconsistent, and I also think that Star Wars had grown and expanded outside the scope of him and his ideas with the EU. This isn't attacking George Lucas, as even he himself admits much of the same thing in the introductory note for the release of Splinter of the Mind's Eye, and he lets writers explore ideas he wouldn't have explored himself in the movies. Where do you stand on that, between adhering to what George Lucas laid down versus pulling back a little so that you don't take him too literally? I think a lot of fandom wars would be less hostile if fans didn't take George so literally, because if you're discounting the EU because George didn't create it, then you have to discount Disney Star Wars because he's less involved in that than he was with the EU. Does any of this make any sense, or do you think I'm just being foolish? Would love to hear back. Hope you find this question interesting enough to answer. Keep doing what you do. Peace and out." Alright, so I'm going to tackle the last part of the question first, or what I think you're kind of asking or trying to get to, and then it's going to hopefully lead us back to the other part, that first part. But I'm going to start with why I am harder on Disney canon for not adhering to, let's call it George Lucas lore or canon, than I am on the EU, which also oftentimes breaks with or doesn't line up with the things Lucas said or did in the films or wherever else it might be. I think that is what you're basically asking or kind of getting at here. And quite simply, the main reason for that is the EU started before George Lucas was even done telling his story or his version of Star Wars. The EU, for me at least, kicked off with me reading Heir to the Empire in 1991, which was 8 years before the prequels even began. And I would argue the bulk of the lore around, say, the Jedi and just how things generally work in the Star Wars galaxy is in those movies, is in the prequels, and not so much in the OT. I mean, in all reality, you don't really learn a ton about the Jedi or how they actually work and what they actually believe. You don't learn a ton of that in the original trilogy. You get the basics, sure, but you certainly don't learn about or get the impression, I would argue, that they are not allowed to have attachments beyond Yoda telling Luke to not go and save his friends in The Empire Strikes Back. But even from that, and only that, I don't know that we can infer that this is the philosophy of the Jedi, that they would never ever put their friends first, or never should. It just seems like in this particular situation, Yoda is like, "Hey Luke, this is really important stuff. Stopping Vader and the Emperor is the most important thing ever, and your friends will realize that too. So if you're honoring what they are also fighting for, you should just stay and not walk headfirst into a trap and get yourself killed, or maybe even worse, become part of the problem by falling to the dark side." And so in the EU, when Mara Jade marries Luke and he proposes to her in Vision of the Future, which came out in 1998, I believe. But either way, I know it came out before the prequels started, though the actual wedding is in a comic book that technically, yes, comes out after the Phantom Menace, though Phantom Menace doesn't really go into the attachment stuff at all. That's more Attack of the Clones. Anyway, trying not to get lost in the details here, Luke marries Mara before we knew from George Lucas that Jedi weren't supposed to do that sort of thing, before Anakin doing it in secret against the rules of the Jedi Order became a major plot point in the prequels. And so I'm not going to go back and be like, the EU sucks now because Jedi aren't supposed to have attachments. I'm not going to be upset that it expanded beyond George Lucas's scope and scale of Star Wars and got it wrong compared to him, you could argue, or you could say, when they had no way of knowing where George was going to take it in the first place, that they wrote it again before he made the prequels, which explains so much about the Jedi and just Star Wars in general. However, when it comes to the Disney canon, well, they had the full story from George Lucas all along, from the very beginning, and they should have known better. They even had Lucas give them story treatments about what would come next, what his sequel trilogy would have looked like, and they decided to go in a different direction. And as the owners of the IP, after paying $4 billion for it, they certainly had the right to do so. They had the right to do whatever the heck they wanted with Star Wars, as I have every right to criticize them for taking it and twisting it into something that doesn't align very well with either vision of Star Wars that I love. It neither seems to fully embrace Lucas canon, and it all but ignores EU canon, unless it needs to bring back a character from it to use the name in order to sell a project, perhaps. But the real issue for me, as someone who very much appreciates what Lucas was trying to say with Star Wars, the message behind it all, if you will, and maybe this is a bit petty or silly, I don't know, you can be the judge of that, I suppose. But many people out there, you could say, don't even know any better or know the difference between Disney Star Wars and Lucas Star Wars, that with Disney creating episodes 7, 8, and 9, they just assume it is all kind of the same thing. That again, Lucas Star Wars and Disney Star Wars is just the same thing. And so when Disney Star Wars goes off the rails and does something that I don't think adheres at all with what Lucas would have done, when it, shall we say, loses its moral compass, like I'd argue The Acolyte kind of does, I tend to go out of my way to let people know that, no, this isn't what I feel like George Lucas would have approved of, that this isn't what his Star Wars would have looked like. And it is, in a sense, similar to how I would say that the EU is not, quote-unquote, George Lucas Star Wars either, but I am more forgiving, I am accepting of it, as I was saying, for the reasons I already laid out. And because, if we're being honest, or in the grand scheme of things here, not a ton of people read the EU, not when compared to the number of people who watch the films, I should say. A lot of people have enjoyed the EU over the years, which is awesome. And if you have read the EU, or if you're getting into it now, maybe you'll no doubt realize what, again, I was talking about before that I figured out because I saw it happen. But a lot of this stuff started before the prequels, so of course it's not all going to align and make sense with what George Lucas did in the prequels. And now going back to the first part of the question, why do I, in a sense, align so strictly with the Lucas canon when he changed his mind all the time? When there are so many contradictions in what he has said over the years? When you can go back to, say, an interview from 1981 and he said this about Darth Vader, and it is totally different from what we learned about him later on in the prequels, or what he maybe said at some other point. And, well, it's all kind of the same thing, or the same way I tend to look at the EU, that things are changing and evolving and in flux until they are actually set in stone. Which is what I would argue the Star Wars movies are. They are definitive. They are what I defer to first and foremost when trying to interpret Star Wars and what it all means and what George Lucas was trying to say and what is actually canon versus what isn't. I also tend to defer to what Lucas said in later years about Star Wars, especially after the prequels were done, when everything was all said and done, after he had sorted it all out and finished the story. Because it's not like 50 years ago when he started working on Star Wars that there was this eureka moment. He wasn't struck by lightning one day and suddenly everything about Star Wars came to him all at once and he knew everything about the galaxy, past, present, and future. In all reality, it started with one small idea, like any story does. It starts with just a spark in your imagination, and it slowly but surely grows from there. It started with Luke Starkiller, and it has grown and changed a lot from there. And I am not going to get upset or confused, you could say, with him having shared an idea about what Star Wars might be or what he sees it as 30 years ago. Again, maybe about Darth Vader or about Anakin, that ultimately changed when he actually told the story in the prequels. And though certainly a strong argument can be made that Star Wars has or needs to evolve beyond the idea of the creator, as you even said, he was cool with the EU because he didn't have the time to tell all these different stories that the fans wanted to hear. And so again, the EU is something that evolved out of the initial ideas Lucas put out there in the original trilogy, done again by other people. And in a large way, it became its own thing, and I love it for what it is. I've also argued before that, yes, Disney does in a sense need to make Star Wars their own, and I think they have failed to do that. I don't have any problem with them exploring areas that Lucas never touched on. In fact, they'd probably be better off doing that, rather than setting everything in the Skywalker saga time period and always overlapping with the stories Lucas told, and the ideals as well. But either way, no matter where you go or what you do always have to try to keep what Lucas said about Star Wars or what he has established about the core of it. You have to keep that as your foundation. It always needs to be there in some respect, in some way, shape, or form, in order to be Star Wars. And I feel like, and you're free to disagree with me, but I feel like Lucasfilm here in the Disney era oftentimes hasn't been all too interested in keeping that George Lucas foundation. And yet they constantly, as I was saying, they constantly use the same times and places and characters he did. But you're taking all these things, these concepts and characters, you're twisting them and distorting them to fit what your idea of Star Wars is. And then they wonder why fans who love George Lucas and what Star Wars has always been, why they don't love what you're doing with it now. Well, I think that's going to be all I got for you this time. Hopefully I answered your question, and if not, hopefully I gave my reasoning behind why I am so hard on Disney, but not so hard on the EU, and why I believe we should try to adhere to George Lucas, but that there is room, yes, for flexibility and exploring new and different things. Or, of course, you can always just go down to the comments, ask a question for a future lightning response video. You just start your comment off with "Hey Thor," you ask your question, I try to answer, and there's already a bunch of really good questions down there that I'll try to answer in a future video, maybe this coming weekend. But whatever the case may be, leave your comments below. Let's talk some Star Wars, and until next time, thanks for watching.